They called him the sickest man in England, but not because of the disease that killed him. This was a king who laughed in the face of his enemies, seduced the most powerful women in the land, and outplayed Parliament for over 2 decades. Yet, in the end, whispers claimed he didn't die naturally, that someone close to him wanted the crown more than they wanted him alive. What really happened inside Whitehall's chambers in those final hours? The rain came down in thin, icy needles, slicing through the grey morning fog that clung to the cobbled streets of The Hague. Inside a drafty townhouse near the harbour, a boy of barely 10 stood at a window, watching ships vanish into the mist. His name was Charles Stuart, and though he bore the blood of kings, he was, for all the world could see, a prince without a kingdom. The year was 1649, and England had just committed an act so unthinkable it sent shockwaves across Europe. His father, King Charles I, had been tried, convicted, and executed for treason by his own people. The axe had fallen in the cold light of January, and with it, the English crown had been shattered. The monarchy was dissolved, the royalists scattered like hunted animals, and in the heart of England, a new experiment in governance, the Commonwealth, took root under the iron will of Oliver Cromwell. Charles, the boy, had escaped with his life, but not with his inheritance. He and his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, fled across the Channel, moving like ghosts between sympathetic courts in France, the Spanish Netherlands, and the Dutch Republic. The glittering palaces and royal coaches of his early childhood were gone, replaced by borrowed chambers, half-empty coffers, and the sharp smell of salt from foreign ports. In the echoing silence of exile, Charles learned 2 things quickly. First, the crown was not just a symbol, it was a target. Second, those who smiled at you in the light might sharpen a knife for you in the dark. A sickly child in a hostile world from the beginning, Charles was marked by a fragile constitution. Letters from this period describe bouts of fever, lingering coughs, and a pallor that worried the few physicians willing to treat a penniless prince. The royalist cause was bleeding out across the Channel, and so were the resources to care for him. But exile gave Charles something else: a tutor's endless lessons in the art of patience. His mother drilled into him the necessity of charm, of wit, of wearing a mask to hide hunger and fear. A king, she whispered in French, must be able to smile while the wolves gnaw at his feet. The making of a survivor even in youth. Charles saw the treachery of courts. In Paris, he watched ambassadors barter loyalty for gold. In Bruges, he overheard officers speaking of abandoning the Stuart cause. Every betrayal was a lesson. Every whispered plot was a page in the book of power he was writing in his mind. And yet, in the cold hours before dawn, he dreamt not of revenge, but of a return. Of marching into London not as a refugee, but as a monarch. Of standing in the great hall at Whitehall Palace, the very place his father had walked to his death, and claiming it as his own. The boy at the window that winter morning could not know the twists awaiting him: restoration, revelry, sickness, and scandal. Nor could he guess that one day history would remember him less for his return to power, and more for the slow, mysterious decay that would earn him a title no king would ever want: the sickest man in England.
The 1650s were a decade written in blood and whispers. Across the Channel, the boy prince had become a young man, tall, dark-haired, with eyes that could shift from warmth to ice in a heartbeat. But Charles Stuart was still a king without a kingdom, living on the charity of those who either feared Cromwell's wrath or hoped to use the exiled monarch as a pawn. England, under the Lord Protector, was no longer a playground for royal pomp. Cromwell's republic was austere, godly, at least in appearance, and merciless toward anything that smelled of monarchy. Charles was a living threat to the new order, a banner for royalist rebellion. And yet, beyond the Channel, a quiet network of loyalists kept his name alive in taverns, manor houses, and secret meeting rooms lit by guttering candles. Scotland's Gambit in 1650. The Scots, frustrated with Cromwell's dominance and wary of being subsumed into an English republic, made their move. They offered Charles the crown of Scotland, on one condition: he must swear to uphold the Presbyterian faith and the Covenanter cause. It was not the unconditional restoration he had dreamed of, but Charles was no fool. A crown, any crown, was a step toward London. He accepted. In July 1650, he landed in Scotland, the salt wind in his hair, the taste of home almost on his tongue. But this return was a hollow one. Cromwell marched north, crushing Scottish resistance at the Battle of Dunbar. Charles was crowned King of Scots at Scone in January 1651, a moment of ancient ritual and fragile hope. But his reign in Scotland lasted barely 18 months before Cromwell's forces pushed him to flight once more. Flight and shadow, the escape was legend. After the catastrophic defeat at Worcester in September 1651, Charles fled, disguised as a commoner, riding through hostile territory with a price on his head. He hid in oak trees, slept in barns, and relied on the courage of ordinary subjects who risked death to protect him. Each narrow escape carved into him the same truth. Survival was the first duty of a king without a throne. For nearly a decade after Worcester, Charles drifted again through the courts of Europe. France, Spain, the Low Countries each offered hospitality with strings attached. He gambled, he flirted, he charmed noblewomen and diplomats alike, all while nursing the ember of restoration. The turning tide by 1658, fate intervened. Cromwell, the Iron Man of the Republic, was dead. His son Richard inherited the protectorate, but lacked his father's ruthless will. England trembled on the edge of instability. Royalist plots thickened like summer storms, and whispers began to drift across the Channel. Come home, the time is now. It was General George Monk, commander of the army in Scotland, who turned rumor into reality. In a careful dance of military power and political persuasion, Monk marched south in early 1660, dissolving the Rump Parliament and clearing the path for the monarchy's return. The Restoration, on May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles rode into London to a thunder of bells, flowers, and cheers. After 11 years of exile, the boy without a throne was now Charles II, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The people hailed him as the Merry Monarch, a king of laughter and liberty after the Puritan gloom of Cromwell's rule. But behind the smiles, Charles knew the truth. The same streets that cheered him today could turn on him tomorrow, and the body that carried him up to the throne was already betraying him from within.
By the early 1670s, the bright mask of the Merry Monarch was beginning to slip. Charles II was still the life of his court, still laughing, still charming, still surrounded by music and mistresses. But those closest to him began to notice the moments when the king's energy would suddenly drain away, leaving him pale and gasping for breath. At first, it was easy to blame the excess. Nights that stretched until dawn, banquets of rich meat and wine, a life lived at full throttle. But behind the whispers in the galleries, a darker theory was beginning to circulate, that something was eating away at the king from within. A body under siege, Charles suffered from violent headaches, recurring fevers, and bouts of trembling that sometimes forced him to grip the edge of his throne just to steady himself. At times, his speech slurred, and his eyes seemed to lose focus. Royal physicians prescribed the usual remedies of the era, bloodletting, purgatives and cordial draughts infused with exotic herbs, but nothing offered lasting relief. Worse still, each treatment seemed to weaken him further. In private, Charles confided to his brother James, Duke of York, that he sometimes felt as though a fire burned in his very marrow. The suspicion of poison, the word poison, was rarely spoken aloud at court, but it lingered in the minds of those who watched the king's decline. Poisoning was not an uncommon tool of politics in 17th century Europe, and Charles had no shortage of enemies. From radical Protestants, who saw him as too Catholic-friendly, to Catholic loyalists, who thought him too easily swayed by Parliament, to foreign powers wary of his shifting alliances. Even within the palace, there were factions who might have preferred James on the throne, and there were rumors, never proven, that one of Charles's mistresses might have been a conduit for influence from abroad, and perhaps something deadlier. The French connection. In 1670, Charles signed the secret Treaty of Dover with King Louis XIV of France, agreeing, in part, to publicly announce his conversion to Catholicism in exchange for French subsidies. This was political dynamite in Protestant England. If word leaked, it could cost him his crown, or his life. Some historians later speculated that the king's mysterious illnesses might have been linked to this political tightrope. If someone believed Charles might betray England to Catholic France, they might have sought to remove him before such a revelation became public. The slow rot, whether by disease, poison, or both, the decline was unmistakable. Charles, once known for his vigor and quick wit, began to tire more easily. At court events, he sometimes withdrew early, leaving his brother or ministers to handle affairs. His once legendary appetite for sport and hunting waned, yet he never allowed the public to see weakness. In the streets of London, he still appeared on horseback, still smiled and waved to cheering crowds. But behind the palace doors, the man many called the sickest in England was fighting a battle he could not win, against an enemy he could neither see nor name. By the mid-1670s, the king's condition had become an open secret among the elite. The question was no longer if he would survive another decade, but whether his death would come suddenly, or be drawn out for all the kingdom to witness. The winter of 1684 to 1685 was bitter, not just in temperature but in spirit. Frost clung to the leaded windows of Whitehall Palace, and the Thames itself froze hard enough for Londoners to hold a frost fair upon its surface, skating, roasting meat over open fires, and selling trinkets. But inside the palace walls, the atmosphere was far from festive. Charles II, once celebrated as the merry monarch for his charm, wit, and unquenchable appetite for life, was now a man besieged by the decay of his own body. He still wore the velvet coats, still greeted ambassadors with a practiced smile, but the sparkle in his eyes was dimming, and the court knew it. The body's betrayal, the king's ailments, were no longer passing inconveniences. His face occasionally swelled without warning, his hands trembled at inopportune moments, and he suffered sudden attacks of dizziness that forced him to grip furniture for balance. Physicians argued over the cause. Some blamed gout, others kidney disease, and a few whispered of subtle foreign substances lingering in his blood. Each morning he submitted to the elaborate rituals of 17th-century medicine, purges, bleedings, and the administration of tonics that ranged from herbal brews to concoctions laced with mercury. Charles bore it with a wry humor, joking that between his doctors and his enemies, one of them would surely kill him before long. London holds its breath. In the coffeehouses and taverns of London, speculation about the king's health was as common as talk of the weather. Merchants debated what a Catholic monarch might mean for trade. Soldiers wondered if unrest might erupt. Puritan preachers thundered about God's judgment on a sinful court. Satirical pamphlets printed anonymously depicted Charles as a decaying lion surrounded by jackals, each wearing the face of a different courtier. In the anonymity of the print shop, the fear and resentment that could not be voiced openly found its outlet. The king's defiance despite his weakness, Charles clung stubbornly to his public role. He attended council meetings, heard petitions, and even presided over entertainments. Determined to project the image of a sovereign still in command, he made a show of walking unaided when he could, even though every step sent pain through his swollen joints. Some historians believe this was not mere vanity, it was strategy. By refusing to vanish from public view, Charles denied his rivals the chance to declare him unfit and seize the machinery of government before his death. Storm clouds on the horizon. As January turned to February 1685, the king's inner circle began preparing for the inevitable. The Duke of York tightened his alliances among Catholic nobles, while Protestant leaders quietly met to discuss contingency plans. In the shadows, envoys from France and the Netherlands worked their own intrigues, seeing opportunity in England's uncertainty. And all the while, Charles continued to play his dangerous balancing act, receiving Louise D one evening, then laughing with Nell Gwyn the next, making sure that neither faction felt wholly shut out. Yet the winter days grew shorter, the air colder, and the king's cough deeper. Whispers spread that the monarch who had survived the plague, the Great Fire of London, and endless political plots might not survive the season. The final act of the merry monarch's reign was approaching, and whether his end would come by nature, by malice, or by the will of God remained an open and deadly question. It happened on a cold February morning in 1685. The day began like so many others. The king was to hold an informal audience before presiding over a meeting of the Privy Council. His valet helped him into a rich, dark blue coat, embroidered with gold thread, and Charles, ever conscious of appearances, took a moment to examine himself in the mirror. The man, looking back, was not the merry monarch of old. His cheeks were pale, the lines around his eyes deeper, and there was a certain slackness to his features. Still, when a servant announced that the council was assembled, he forced his smile into place. The sudden fall the council chamber at Whitehall was warm from the crackling hearth, the air heavy with the smell of burning oak. Ministers rose as Charles entered, bowing low. The king waved them back to their seats with his usual nonchalance. But as he moved toward the head of the table, his step faltered, a hand shot to the polished wood for support. Then, without warning, the king stiffened, eyes wide, before collapsing to the floor. The thud was followed by the scrape of chairs and the collective intake of breath from the assembled lords. Panic in the palace for a moment. There was chaos. Some rushed to lift him. Others shouted for the royal physicians. The Duke of York, pale but composed, took charge, ordering everyone except the most necessary attendants out of the room. Charles was carried to his bedchamber, where doctors arrived within minutes, armed with the tools of their trade, lancets for bleeding, jars of leeches, and a bewildering array of tinctures. The king's lucid plea to everyone's surprise, Charles regained consciousness briefly. His breathing was labored, but his voice was steady enough to say, "Let not poor Nellie starve." It was a final nod to his beloved mistress Nell Gwyn, a reminder that even in crisis, the king's charm and irreverence shone through. Then his head fell back against the pillows, and the physicians began their work. The battle for his life, what followed, was an ordeal that reads today like slow torture. Over the next several days, the king was bled multiple times. In total, losing nearly a pint of blood. He was given emetics to induce vomiting, purgatives to clear the bowels, and even blistering agents applied to his skin in hopes of drawing out the illness. The treatments weakened him further, but in 1685, they were the standard of care for a monarch. Outside his chambers, the palace was a pressure cooker of political maneuvering. The Duke of York met privately with Catholic allies, while Protestant lords whispered about emergency measures to secure the throne for someone more acceptable to their cause. A kingdom holds its breath. News of the king's collapse traveled fast. Crowds gathered outside Whitehall's gates, hoping for word. Coffee houses buzzed with rumors. Some claimed the king had been poisoned, others that it was divine punishment for his debauchery. Merchants hesitated to close deals, fearing instability. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent dispatches back to their courts. The collapse at Whitehall was more than a medical crisis. It was the moment England realized that the fragile balance Charles had maintained for 2 decades between Catholic and Protestant, Parliament and Crown, vice and virtue, was about to shatter. The question was no longer if the merry monarch would die, but when, and who would inherit the storm he would leave behind. The air in the king's bedchamber was heavy with the smell of candle wax and burnt herbs. It was said that Charles II once presided over a court of wit and music. Now the only sound was the rasp of his breathing, punctuated by the murmurs of anxious attendants. Outside the room, the corridors of Whitehall buzzed with something far more dangerous than concern. Whispers, the poisoning rumors. From the moment Charles collapsed, rumors had raced across London like wildfire. Some swore that the king had been poisoned, perhaps by a foreign agent, perhaps by his own court. Theories varied wildly, that the French had arranged it to ensure a Catholic succession through the Duke of York, that Protestant conspirators had acted first to prevent exactly that outcome, that one of his own mistresses, fallen out of favor, had slipped something into his wine. The fact that no one could agree on who the culprit might be only deepened the sense of intrigue. Political vultures in the great gallery outside the chamber. The Duke of York stood in quiet conversation with Father Huddleston, the Catholic priest who had long served in the shadows. Protestant courtiers viewed this with barely concealed alarm. They knew that James, Duke of York, was openly Catholic, and his ascension could reignite the fires of religious conflict that Charles had spent his reign trying to douse. Inside the room, the physicians worked tirelessly, but to little effect. Each day, Charles weakened, and each day, factions maneuvered for position. Ministers plotted emergency measures, envoys sent secret letters, and family members eyed one another with suspicion. A secret admission on the evening of February 5th. As the candles guttered low, Father Huddleston was quietly ushered into the king's chamber. Witnesses would later claim that Charles, lucid for the first time in hours, requested the priest's presence, not for counsel, but for confession. What passed between the two men would become one of the most hotly debated moments in English royal history. Some believe Charles converted to Catholicism on his deathbed, sealing his brother's path to the throne. Others dismiss it as propaganda, meant to frame the king's final hours as a triumph for Rome. Betrayal or loyalty. Those who loved the king were torn. If the conversion were true, had Charles betrayed the Protestant faith he had sworn to uphold? Or had he, in secret, been a Catholic all along, and only now revealed it in the last moments of his life? The tension in the palace was palpable. Outside the gates, Londoners argued in taverns and on street corners, some toasting the king's courage, others cursing his supposed treachery. the shadow over England. By the time the sun rose on February 6th, the king's strength had ebbed to almost nothing. Ministers spoke in hushed tones of preparing for the inevitable. The court tailor began laying out black mourning clothes. But for those who believed in the poisoning theory, there was still one urgent question that no physician could answer. If Charles had been murdered, who had gained the most from his death? The answer, some feared, was already waiting in the wings, wearing the crown in his mind long before the coronation. The morning of February 6, 1685, dawned cold and damp over London. The sky above Whitehall Palace was the colour of ash, and a mist clung stubbornly to the Thames, muffling the sounds of the waking city. Inside the palace, however, there was no mistaking the sound of history being written, in shallow, laboured breaths. The last hours. Charles II lay propped up on his pillows, his once lively eyes dimmed to a glassy stare. Those present swore they could still see flashes of his charm, the occasional crooked smile, the brief tightening of his hand over a loyal attendant's fingers. But the intervals grew longer and weaker. The physicians had long since abandoned their confidence. They had tried bleeding, purging, herbal draughts, and even heated cups pressed to the king's skin in desperate attempts to draw out the sickness. Nothing worked. The body that had survived wars, revolts, and countless nights of revelry was finally surrendering. A court holding its breath. Every member of the royal household knew the truth. With each passing minute, they were living in the final reign of Charles II. Ministers hovered in doorways, courtiers tried to mask their anticipation, and even family members seemed caught between grief and calculation. James, Duke of York, maintained a stoic facade, but those who studied him closely claimed his eyes flickered with something sharper than sorrow, resolve. He knew the moment his brother breathed his last, the kingdom would look to him. Whether it looked in welcome or in fear was another matter entirely. The king's last words. According to Father Huddleston, Charles's last confession was made in whispers, too faint for most to hear. But one thing was heard by nearly everyone in the room. The king's final public words, "Let not poor Nellie starve." It was a reference to Nell Gwynn, his longtime mistress, who had remained loyal to him through scandal and intrigue. Even as his life ebbed away, Charles too remembered those he loved, a final flash of the charm that had earned him the nickname the Merry Monarch. At approximately 11:45 a.m., witnesses described a single deep exhale that seemed to carry the weight of an entire era. The candles flickered, the room fell silent, and a great stillness settled over Whitehall. The king was dead. No gun was fired, no trumpet sounded. History changed not with an explosion, but with the quiet closing of a pair of weary eyes. The immediate aftermath, almost instantly, the balance of power shifted. The Duke of York, now King James II, ordered the formal proclamation of his accession. Outside the palace, criers read the news to the city. Bells tolled, but whether in mourning or warning depended on who heard them. In the taverns, the whispers began anew. Had the king been helped to his death? Had James known of it? And what would England become under a Catholic monarch at a time when the kingdom still bore the scars of religious war? The stage was set for the final chapter, where the death of Charles II became not an ending, but the opening act of one of England's most turbulent reigns. The myths that outlived the man Charles II's reign was painted in two colors, one of scandal and one of survival. To some, he was the merry monarch, the king who restored joy to a nation weary of Puritan austerity. To others, he was the sickest man in England, not for the illness that took his life, but for his alleged moral corruption, a monarch who indulged in excess while the kingdom's politics teetered on the brink. The truth, as it so often does, sat somewhere in between. Charles had been a shrewd politician, navigating the treacherous waters of post-Civil War England with a balance of wit, patience, and calculated charm. He had outlived his enemies, outmaneuvered Parliament when necessary, and kept the throne stable during decades when stability seemed impossible. The suspicions, but death rarely closes the book on a figure as controversial as Charles. Rumors persisted, of poisoning, of deliberate neglect by those who stood to benefit from his passing, of whispered confessions never recorded in official documents. The fact that his brother James ascended immediately, without challenge, only deepened the suspicions. Historians, centuries later, would debate endlessly. Was Charles a victim of natural decline, or a casualty of political ambition? No conclusive evidence was ever found, but the whispers clung to his memory like fog over the Thames. The political shockwave. With James II's rise, The religious question that Charles had skillfully kept in the shadows now stepped into the blinding light. James's open Catholicism would ignite tensions that Charles had managed to keep contained, leading directly to the events of the Glorious Revolution just 3 years later. Some argued that if Charles had lived longer, England might have avoided that upheaval, that his particular brand of diplomacy could have delayed, if not prevented, the crisis. The personal legacy beyond politics. Charles left a trail of human stories: his mistresses, his illegitimate children, his patronage of science and the arts, his fascination with the Royal Society. He was as much a man of curiosity as he was of indulgence. His death did not erase the memory of his laughter, his wit, or his ability to win over even his fiercest critics, at least temporarily. In that way, Charles II lived on, not just in dusty history books, but in the folklore of England. A lesson from the Sickest Man. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of Charles II's life is this: power does not protect you from betrayal, charm does not shield you from death, and even the most celebrated ruler can be remembered as both savior and sinner. As the centuries pass, the question remains: was Charles II truly the sickest man in England? Or was that title just another weapon in the political battles that outlived him? The candle had burned out in Whitehall that cold February morning, but the shadow of Charles II, complex, flawed, and endlessly debated, still flickers in the corners of history.